literally hundreds and hundreds of pages. There's also some of the early analysis of Soviet work in the areas of parapsychology, or what they used to call paraphysics.
This is very scary, and quite frankly, I've known about HAARP for many years, and I've done about 8 shows on climate and weather, and I just find it interesting that this technology, and correct me if I'm incorrect, that fires, multi-billion watt radio frequency beams into the atmosphere?
Well, the way it's effective radiated power is how it's termed, and it's like a one-page formula for how that's expressed. But essentially, it's the concentrating effect, and it's the transmitter will have an effective radiated power when they finish their next phase of about 1 billion watts. And it's about half that now. And this is effective radiated power, which is the amount of energy and its relationship at the point of discharge. At the point where you're striking the effect, which is the ionosphere in this case. And here's something else that needs to be considered in conjunction with that, is there's an amplification effect. What was found at one point in the very low frequency ranges, there was sort of a triggering effect, almost like a primer on a bullet. The primer is that little explosion that releases the bigger explosion. And in this case, the bigger explosion was in the ionosphere, and this coherent signal actually caused the signal to amplify once it arrived there 1,000 times and create a virtual particle rain in Antarctica, because if these particles follow those magnetic field lines. And just the way this whole thing unfolded, startled everyone, because they didn't expect that, number one. And that creates even bigger implications for an antenna array on the ground that has the ability to sweep the spectrum for 16 decades, from very low frequency, extremely low frequency, all the way up to visible light, in terms of being able to create effects in the upper atmosphere and ionosphere.
Did you say for 16 decades?
Yes, that's the bandwidth, if you will.
Okay, so you meant decades as a part of bandwidth, not time.
Right.
Okay.
And that bandwidth is extraordinary. It's virtually everything we rely on for communication, which was another possibility in use of the system, is the ability to carry your communications. Because think about it, you can sweep all the spectrum and literally disrupt everyone else's, but because you're doing the disrupting, you can also put a signal on what you're carrying and carry your own communications effectively. So, when you think about, again, military applications of a technology, it's pretty extraordinary what's being learned from this developmental prototype in Alaska. And it goes back to the early Soviet research, where the people may remember the woodpecker signal in the early 70s, and was attributed to these transmitters back in the former Soviet Union. It turns out those were the predecessors, the first ionospheric heaters ever made. And they were attributed with all kinds of things, from creating power failures, which is another thing that is potential with HAARP, because you can create, again, manipulating the energy that's really, think about it like plugging into the energy dynamo of the Earth when you think about HAARP in some of its applications. So you got the plug isn't where the power is, but it certainly gets it to what it needs to do.
And it can mimic the effect of the sun?
You're essentially tapping that, because that's the source of energy for the ionosphere and the magnetosphere around it, is the interrelationship between the energy incoming from the sun and the rotation of the planet, as a big magnet. Or if you think about what an alternating motor is, it's a magnet spinning at a rapid speed, and it's the same kind of idea. And this is where you link back to some of these big concepts of the thinkers like Tesla, and those that followed him and preceded him. You end up with things like HAARP.
Didn't Tesla just have a vision of energy being free and available without electricity as we know it?
Yeah, and that was through principles of resonance, where we would really tap the dynamo of the planet in a way that would allow us to literally pull the energy that the planet generates. And this is where if you look at Tesla's work, the whole of his work, and I have all of his patents here, and I have all of his lectures in English.
You have all of his patents there?
Yeah.
I noticed that Raytheon owns some of his patents.
Well, all of Tesla's patents are long expired, but in terms of Eastland's work, yes, they have that, and some of those patents are due to expire, in not too distant future, just based on the 17-year patent laws in the U.S. Some of those go back to the 1980s.
That should be open source. Do you know that?
Yeah, and some of it is, but the files ought to be open now, and except what they've classified, of course, and who knows how much of that material is really available. The Eastland family is doing quite a bit now, and plan to do more release, I think, of Dr. Eastland's work. So we'll look for that in the future too. I think that'll be a good thing for keeping this discussion and debate alive. And it's amazing. In 15 years on the topic, it continues to bubble in and out of the news. And political groups, at least out of the United States, have actively been working on it. European Parliament, some of the parliaments in Europe have their own legislation on these kinds of issues. And, so in that sense, I think a lot's happened. But at the same time, the risks associated with this technology are what concerns me. And, it's the, just trust us. And I think we've all been, anyone who's got any gray hair at all has enough historical knowledge of what's happened in this country to say the only trust the government deserves is trust people are willing to give it, and we give it too much too often.
Well, this part of technology that's used by the military-industrial complex and by the military, this is such high-level technology. It's so advanced, and it's so dangerous. I cannot imagine that it isn't already altering the radiation levels on this Earth.
Well, I think there's been certain levels of experiments, but HAARP is not on all the time. It's used intermittently. But I would say these kinds of systems, and there are several transmitters now around the world. And
that's what I heard. Where are they located?
You have across Canada, there's a number of transmitters. The ISACAT system in Europe, which includes Tromsø, Norway, a number of other cooperating countries there.
Did you say Norway?
Yeah. And then you have the old Soviet transmitters, which some of those are still probably used experimentally, but certainly they exist. And then you have Arecibo, Puerto Rico, and the Chinese have actually announced sort of some research in this direction as well. So, there's quite a few. The idea of weather modification, not just through HAARP, but through many other technologies, have been talked about in Chinese military journals, Russian journals for years, and our own. And the work in this area across several fronts has advanced to the point where people are actively experimenting or manipulating weather in one region for their benefit. And there's very little restriction on this. In fact, the only international treaty on environmental manipulation, like most treaties, exempt what you do in your own territory, within your own sovereign region. And so, weather doesn't respect artificial lines drawn on a map, number one, and this is where the area becomes important. And that treaty goes back to 1977. That's 32 years ago.
What treaty are you referring to?
It's an international environmental treaty where we agreed not to use weather modification or other forms of geophysical manipulation as weapons of war. And this treaty was signed by us in 1977. It's referenced in the Angels Don't Play This HAARP book.
Okay.
But the point is the science has changed, and it was Cheney and Rumsfeld were calling for the abandonment of that treaty before those guys disappeared from the scene on the basis that our technology advanced so much that we really needed to use it, which was sort of their view of the world anyway. Anything that would work, they wanted to use. Regardless of the consequences. And I think those treaties were thought out then for obvious reasons, and today they really need to be revisited because the technologies have changed in a number of areas. It was the last Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, and we cited this in the book Earth Rising, the Revolution. He was lecturing back in 1997 at the University of Georgia, and I'm pulling his quote now as we're talking about it. And what he was talking about were technologies that could, do the kinds of things in terms of geophysical manipulation.
Are you talking about direct energy weapons?
Yes, and what he said is, and I quote, "Others are engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism whereby they can alter climate, set off earthquakes and volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves," unquote. And that was a DoD news briefing of Secretary of Defense William Cohen back April 28th, 19.